Today's elements of art are going to be shape and form, the elements of area and mass. Just as with line, these are elements that have mathematical definitions as well as art definitions. So shape is, just like you think mathematically, a flat two-dimensional area with defined boundaries. Form is an object with defined three-dimensional volume. So the question for today then is, are these images that you see on the screen examples of shapes or forms? And what about their definitions leads you to your conclusion of whether what you see on the screen is a shape or a form? Just as with line, there are qualities of shape and form that can have variations. Shapes and forms can be organic or geometric. Again, organic shapes are based out of nature. They're often curved in some way. They don't require mechanical assistance, whereas those geometric forms do require mechanical assistance to be created. Organic shapes or forms, like the artworks that are made by Andy Goldsworthy, reference the natural world. You can see here how he has taken these rocks and pebbles that are irregularly shaped because they come from nature and has organized them in a more ordered sense, creating order from chaos. On the other hand, minimalist sculptors, like Tony Smith, use geometric shapes or forms to enhance the mechanical nature of their sculptures and their artworks. You can have hard or soft edges in your shapes or forms. Think about how a very sharp, sleek-edged form or shape communicates something different to you than something with soft edges. In this particular painting, how does the softness inspire a mood or feeling with the shapes in this painting? And how would this feel different if it were made with hard-edged shapes? Shapes or forms can also be implied rather than concrete. Implied shapes or forms are often created by the positioning of other shapes around them. And in some cases, where depending on how you look at an object, you can see the positive shape, which is the figure in a painting, or you can see a shape from the background or the negative shape. When that composition has a figure or a positive shape and a ground or a negative shape, that either one could be the emphasis, and sometimes it switches between one another like an illusion, it's called figure-ground reversal. And implied shapes or figure-ground reversal often show up in more places than we initially expect, like in advertising. Consider the FedEx logo, which has an arrow installed in the negative space between the E and the X, indicating their forward motion. There can also be static and dynamic forms. Static forms feel stagnant, they feel stable, they feel rooted into the ground. Consider the pyramid as a symbol of architecture, not only because it is a very easy shape to build large with in architecture given stone materials, but also the fact that the stability of the pyramid represents the stability of the leader's reign. And pyramids are not exclusive to Egypt. Pyramids have shown up all over the world, from Mexico and South America to Cambodia, and they represent static, stable forms, as opposed to dynamic forms, which are forms of motion. Dynamic forms often feel like they may topple over, like they were caught in mid-motion. Looking at these cups now, Which of these cups, which are very similar, feels more dynamic to you? And why does it feel that way? What about that shape makes you feel that that one is more dynamic? There are also open and closed forms. Open forms, like dynamic forms, are often open to space. They often leave places where the background can interact with the figure itself, as opposed to closed forms. Closed forms don't have a lot of interaction between the air around them that surrounds them, their negative space, and the positive space of the figure itself. They are more solid. And this question then is a challenge for you about how can your understanding of dynamic and static and opened and closed forms tell you something about the priorities of a different culture, especially considering what you just heard about the pyramids. How does the very dynamic, very open Hellenistic Greek statues, how does that differ from the very closed, very stable, the wide base and the backed form of the ancient Egyptian statues? How are those different, and how can those differences tell you something about the different priorities of those two cultures? Pause if you need time to answer that, and then I'm going to explore this one in a little bit more depth. When looking at Hellenistic Greek forms and knowing about the Hellenistic period of Greece, this is a time that was widely celebrated for a cultural flowering in ancient Greece. It was very extravagant living. It was very exuberant, very expressive in its art forms, not only in sculpture, but also in the plays and the poetry that was being written at the time. And many people also condemned this time for being hedonistic, for being given to excesses. And you can see in this statue that even though very impressive in how complex it is, it also has left itself vulnerable to the ravages of time. It has, in fact, because it is so delicate, broken in several places. On the other hand, you have the Egyptian statue. Here, the pharaoh is very straightforward facing. The space between his legs is even filled. And that's not because ancient Egyptians couldn't carve out that space without the statue breaking. It's because they wanted that space filled. Because for ancient Egyptians, stability was prized over all. In ancient Egypt, it was much more important that the pharaoh represent stability during his reign than he represent excessiveness, than he represent lavishness or high emotionality. They would rather know that the pharaoh is going to take care of them for all eternity than be impressed by his lavish deeds. And just as we discussed in line, where line can be built on to create other elements of art, shape too can be used to mimic the more dimensional element of form. So form, of course, only occurs in 3 dimensions. So in order for artists to replicate a 3D form through painting or drawing on a 2D surface, they must use illusions with shapes or lines or values. Sometimes artists will then use those illusions to create spaces on a 2D plane that actually can't even exist in the 3D world. MC Escher was famously known for creating posters or drawings or prints of 3D worlds that could not exist anywhere but on a 2-dimensional surface. And then there are artists like LeWitt who use 3-dimensional form to reference those 2-dimensional drawings. So he is playing with those conventions of 2-dimensionality and 3-dimensionality using what we associate with two-dimensionality when it imitates three-dimensionality, but using that two-dimensional convention on a three-dimensional plane, as in these open modular cubes. And some artists embrace the flatness of two-dimensionality. Henri Matisse created paper collages, doing what he called paintings with scissors, where he would cut out flat, colorful shapes, creating large-scale murals with his paper collages. Matisse and many artists of his time, especially as the world was trending towards abstraction in the late modern era, felt that using art to create illusions was taking part in a kind of deception, that it was not true to his material. So if his paper was flat, then he should embrace the flatness of paper and not try to use the paper to imitate something that it was not. But whether you have a very flat composition or one that is extremely convincing as an illusion of reality, when you break it down, what you have is a series of shapes and lines. Even if they are very complexly laid out, they are, when you break it down, still the basic elements of art.